Okay, cool. Yeah, welcome. I'm Rosa, the Caribbean officer at Oxford African and Caribbean Society. And this is going to be the third event in our Cultural Conversations panel, Cultural Conversation series on Caribbean history and identity.
And hi everyone, I'm Drew and sorry about that. I'm the Caribbean officer at Cambridge ACS and the co-host of this event, which is the first of its kind at Oxford ACS and I believe at Cambridge as well. So really groundbreaking stuff. And we invite our speakers today to uncover their roles that they've played in bringing Caribbean history to the forefront through the mediums of literature and history. We're joined by Lavinya Stennett, Dr. Merle Collins and Dr. Rochelle Rowe as they speak on the theme of learning and unlearning our Caribbean identities and heritage.
Lavinya Stennett is a writer, activist and founder and CEO of the Black Curriculum. Graduating with a first class from SOAS in 2019, she has most recently authored a paper exploring marine ecology in Jamaica and Brazil. Lavinya was recently named one of the Sunday Times 50 Women of the Year and was awarded Trailblazer of the Year by Hello magazine, as well as featuring in Vogue and GQ for her activism. The Black Curriculum is a social enterprise founded in 2019, working to teach and support the teaching of Black history all year round, aiming to empower all students with a sense of identity and belonging.
And Dr. Merle is a professor in the Department of English and the Comparative Literature Program at the University of Maryland, College Park. She's also the director of UMD's Latin American Studies Center, or LASC. She's the author of novels Angel and The Color of Forgetting, the poetry collections Because the Dawn Breaks, Rotten Pomerac, and The Lady in a Boat, and short story collections Rain Darling and The Ladies Are Upstairs. Her poetry and stories have also been widely anthologized. Collins has published several essays on Caribbean literature and politics and society in Grenada. Among her current continuing research projects are Grenadian students in Cuba and the Grenadian mother of Malcolm X, on which she wrote a biographical essay, Louise Landon Norton Little, mother of Malcolm X. She's produced a video documentary, Sriracha and Nation, which explores African influences in Grenada. Also interested in theatre and performance, she founded a Maryland-based community theatre group, Caravision Community Theatre.
And finally, Dr. Rochelle Rowe is a British writer and a historian of gender, race and the body. She obtained a PhD in history from the University of Essex in 2010, where she helped pioneer interest in the history of beauty and beauty culture, now an established area there. She has published in the Radical History Review, Gender and History, and other journals. Rochelle's career in higher education includes teaching history and leading major research programs of learning and development at Essex, Exeter, London universities, and at UCL, where she now focuses on leadership development. Her first book, Imagining Caribbean Womanhood, tells a feminist history of Black beauty spanning the British West Indies, Harlem, and post-war London, and is published by the Manchester University Press. Her next work to be published is in a multi-volume collection, The Cultural History of Beauty, explores Black Victorian women and beauty in the age of empire. She has given talks at universities across the country and internationally. Most recently, she contributed to the Black in Academia event series, sharing her reflections to inspire new Black researchers in academia. So welcome, thank you for our panelists for joining us today. And without further ado, Lavinya Stennett will be starting off with a talk.
Thank you. I don't have any slides, but good evening, everybody. It's really lovely to be in the presence of you and also two other incredible women. So I'm going to keep mine really, really short. I'm going to hope that I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes. And my talk is more broadly on the role of history in the reclamation of identities. So as mentioned, I'm Lavinya, and a lot of my passions and work surrounds art and bringing the arts, for example, poetry and music into the space of education. I grew up in a very strict Jamaican household, so education in its most formal sense really didn't include the arts, and I have always been a person that felt that I would flow very naturally when it comes to the arts, if you like. And bringing those two spaces together has been something very transformational for me. And I do believe at that intersection lies a lot of creativity and room for actual social change. And so I hope in this talk I can demonstrate that. So yeah, as I mentioned, I've always kind of taken an interest in arts. And before I went to university, I was really thinking about doing things for the community that would be about kind of poetry, bringing women together. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And it was only until I got into SOAS, I actually saw the magnitude of people who were really interested in kind of history and African history at that. So I studied development and African studies. And within that, I really wanted from the outset to focus on Jamaican history. So I found every opportunity I could to insert something about Jamaica. And I think within that, it was really powerful to see how music continuously kept coming in as a vehicle of social change. So when we're thinking about culture, culture isn't just some kind of static thing that happens to people. It's a process that is carried through language, it's carried through music and sound, and it relates to the social atmosphere that we're in, or the social atmosphere of that time. And so the more I was studying, it gave me more of a perspective of Jamaica being not only a place where there's loads of rhythms and like vibes, if you like, because that's where I come from in terms of my background, like being born and bred in London, looking into what I perceived to be Jamaican culture was things like music and carnival and, you know, very kind of tangible things, but it just didn't feel that I kind of understood this identity that carried such history properly. But it was only until I was studying that I saw that there was such not only poetic influence in terms of the lyrics of people like Dennis Brown, but also they were speaking to a social atmosphere. And the more that we go into the music, we actually can see what kind of context we were in at the time. So I think that's where my head was. And I think I tried a lot to reimagine and imagine, get myself into that mindset, that time period as to what it would be like living in a colonial society or a newly independent society that had remnants of colonialism and the legacies of colonialism living on. And so kind of thinking about the music that was there, it really kind of brought me to a place where instead of thinking about history as an alternative subject, I could just study the music and kind of use that as an academic reference for a lot of the work that I was doing. So I was very blessed to have a lecturer who was actually from Ghana, Dr. Kwadjo. And he actually just allowed me to use music from YouTube to actually write a lot of the work that I was doing around the essays around liberation and thinking about the role of not only resistance, but also culture more broadly. And so kind of thinking about education in that, it was really, really key that when we're thinking about Caribbean history and identities, we were using an array of sources, because it's not just being able to kind of read the textbooks, which we know are very, very colonized, and I'll speak more about that in a second, but being able to kind of draw influence from music, which transcends space and time. So in kind of thinking about Caribbean history more broadly, I was narrowing it down slowly. And it came to a point where I actually realized that there is a piece of history that exists that is very traumatic. And I want to kind of get into that. I want to see what it was like. I don't just want to read narratives of, yeah, you know, we came into slavery and that was, you know, the only kind of fixed narrative that we had. In fact, we were actually challenged to go deeper. And I think
reading the work of like Toni Morrison and seeing how she was able to kind of articulate a lot of those experiences, but bringing in a lot of kind of spirituality into that, I could see that there were other ways of using literature and also music as well to kind of convey those experiences, which differed a lot from my upbringing. So yeah, so in my second year of uni, I decided that, well, I actually didn't decide in my second year at all. It was in my third year that I actually nailed down that our Caribbean experiences are highly defined and impacted by narratives of colonialism, and that's not the Caribbean that I know. It's not the Caribbean that I want to feel connected to, and particularly because in SOAS is an institution that was a hub for colonial administrators. It felt very important for me to actually be in that space and actually use a lot of the archives and also the lecturers to be able to kind of rethink how we actually use that space in the academy and the reproduction of certain knowledges. So I made it really clear to a lot of my lecturers that I really wanted to do something that was about Jamaica, but also Maroons, particularly because in my practice and in a lot of the research that I was doing, there was none. And I think I can see that as a pattern across many universities, that there's a lot of like Caribbean and, there's a lot of literature that relates to Africa more broadly, or Black, so let's just say Black history, but it really doesn't kind of touch on the Caribbean. If it does, it's only to do with slavery. So in terms of where I was coming from, I wanted to think about narratives that weren't just solely framed by from a very colonial perspective. And so, yeah, I spoke with my lecturers, and there was a lot of, I guess, back and forth. And very interestingly at the time, the way that I kind of got my lecturers on board, who were not traditionally from our experiences, the way that they understood the importance of this was through class and peasant revolts in the Caribbean and Brazil and so forth. So there was a lot of conversations, and I think SOAS is an incredible space for that, where you can kind of bridge together a lot of these things. So given that freedom, it was really important that freedom as a concept wasn't just explored solely through just independence and, post-colonialism, as we'd call it, but actually freedom in terms of agency and freedom in terms of the actions of that society and the actual material conditions. And it was the more that I was listening and also talking with people that I actually just didn't agree with this idea that Jamaica was a colony, a newly independent country, but in fact is still under what we would call neo-colonialism. And so in terms of my perspective, it was actually drawing on a lot of the work of Walter Rodney and his late wife, Patricia, who came to visit us. There was a lot of conversations that enabled me to actually understand how broader this kind of picture is of colonialism having that kind of legacy of taking away narratives of agency. So what I'm trying to say is that in summary, there was a lot of kind of conversations and thoughts that were happening around what does the Caribbean actually represent. And it was the more that I went deeper that I saw that even narratives to do with Maroons, and which you would class as like very kind of I can't say this word, but it speaks about liberation and resistance, that was still characterized in a very European way. So when we actually looked at the narratives of Maroons, it was only to do with resistance and defense, and how Nanny would, even from a gender perspective, there was really weird narratives of her doing these like really magical things, and it didn't really kind of give us a proper sense of what the experiences and the lives were like of people who were in Jamaica and actually kind of decided to create an alternative reality for themselves. So it was very bold, but at the time I decided that I'm not going to just solely focus on narratives that existed in the textbooks, but I'm going to go a bit deeper and actually explore how Black geographies connected to Maroons' agency, and how basically they were able to kind of create societies that were full of freedom and actually show the complexity of our cultures rather than just relying simply on colonial narratives. So yes, there's a lot of work at the moment that's out there by Catherine McKittrick, who's really good in terms of explaining what Black geographies are as it connects to America. And I think in terms of the academy, I think there absolutely needs to be more work done in that regard in the Caribbean, because a lot of that text is still very US centric, which isn't a problem because I feel like it's really important to draw parallels, but it's really key that we're able to kind of look at the perspectives of Black geographies from the Caribbean, because a lot of what Maroons are able to do actually set the course for future experiences of Maroons, not only in Jamaica, but also Brazil, Suriname, and even Cape Verde as well. So when I understand my Caribbean identity, it makes me actually understand that not only are we redefining the course of colonialism and that whole idea of being boxed in and having our agency and also the ability to express oneself stripped away, but actually our cultures do exist through time, and they don't just stop with so they continue. And I think that's the beauty of culture. So going back to my dissertation, it was really important that I centered place, culture, and also the social dynamics. And so I went a lot deeper into kind of exploring the ecology of the Maroon community. So in particular, the Windward community in Eastern Jamaica, but also the communities in Pernambuco, Brazil as well, who were obviously not Jamaican, but were Maroons as well. So I was kind of looking at what similarities there were. So going into the soil they use, using examples of kind of the way that they formed in terms of their groupings, and just really giving them a space to feel centered. And I think that's really important in reclaiming space and reclaiming narratives in the academy. It's about giving the centrality of those experiences a place to sit and actually be appreciated, rather than just thinking about defense and just the notion of resistance. And that does not mean that resistance isn't an important concept to actually think about. I think it's really important that resistance is studied, but it can't just be the only object of understanding our whole ontology. So by centering Maroons in their actual kind of spatial awareness, their spatial use of the land, it gave much more freedom to me to reimagine what life could look like. So history for me is really important, not only to set the tone of where we can go, but also to remember what is possible, even though the history textbooks might not tell us. But within that journey, it was very difficult because there was obviously a lot of racist literature that I had to go through, and just like, I'm not going to swear, but it was just a lot of rubbish I was hearing, and it just didn't feel like the academy would challenge that if given the opportunity, but instead would rather build off that work. So a lot of the theories that I was using came from the US. It also came from textbooks, like I mentioned, like Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, but nothing specifically rooted in the Caribbean. So in terms of that process of actually shifting how these topics are engaged with in the academy into practice, it was really important for me to have conversations as well with people about the Maroons and actually kind of challenge misconceptions as well, because I don't want this work to just sit in a paper and it just sits there and it's just knowledge that is there, because again, that is the antithesis of what I believe our culture is. It's again, something that is not static, and orality is very, very important in continuing that legacy. So I do try my best, and I'm trying my best now to convey the importance of Maroons, going back into their sense of agency. And so I think for me, that was a mind shift that I had back in 2019. I don't know what I was on. I was doing a lot in university. I was running a society, doing my dissertation, and also running the Black curriculum at the same time. But I think looking at the thread, it all connects, because if I never studied Maroons, I don't think I would have had the same kind of perspective that I have now about challenging the idea that the education system at the moment is fit for purpose, in the sense that Black history isn't something that is taught but it's not taught in the sense of agency. It's not giving young people a sense of empowerment or identity. And so history is that tool. It is the enabler that gives us a sense of self. And so that's what the Black curriculum is about. So at the moment, we are the leading brand for Black British history. And our whole aim is to empower students with a sense of identity and belonging through the teaching of Black British history, particularly Black British history all year round. And that's important for young Black people. It's important for every young person who goes through the education system, because if nobody knows our history, racism will continue. It will continue to miseducate people and actually leave a lot of people without the knowledge of self. And I think that journey of understanding yourself, it's really important. And it gives you a lot more freedom to navigate the world as well. And so the Black curriculum, we established ourselves in 2019. And our whole aim, as I said, is to empower students with a sense of identity, but we do that through teaching young people in schools and also through training the teachers to teach Black history. Because at the moment, their confidence levels, there was a parliamentary statistic that came out yesterday, I believe, or the day before, that showed that 80% of teachers actually don't feel that they feel confident enough to teach Black history. So we give them the training to equip them with the confidence, the tools, the language, to be able to actually teach it. And when we speak about Black history, at the moment is Black British history, but I do have aims to carry this into the Caribbean one day, but also bringing together other organizations across the world who are also thinking about reclaiming the identity from a Black perspective, because I do think that, carrying on the roots of Marcus Garvey and thinking about liberation efforts, we are one. And I think we definitely need to continue that momentum through. So the hopes is that we can change the education system in the UK first, and then kind of branch out to the rest of the world. But yes, if you want to know more about the Black curriculum, our website is theblackcurriculum.com. Same with our Instagram. Twitter is Curriculum Black. And we're going to be announcing stuff soon. So you can also find my dissertation online. It's very long, so I'm going to put it into the chat. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Lavinya. I've been taking so many notes, and somebody already put in the chat that they can feel their brain growing from your first few minutes. And you've touched on so many points, just like the importance of diversifying who you're teaching so that it goes into what the students can learn and also how comfortable they can learn. There's too much to talk about, but thank you so much for your talk. And next up, we have Dr. Merle Collins.
Thank you, and thank you for that presentation. There were so many things to think about, and I appreciate that. I just want to say that one of the things I looked at as I was reviewing what you asked me to do, I saw this thing about learning and unlearning your Caribbean heritage. And I'm not so sure that I've done the unlearning, but I understand the context in which you're saying this. I want to begin giving what is going to be an autobiographical narrative against the background of Caribbean history and culture. And I want to begin that with a poem, Home, which I wrote somewhat time in the 1990s. It was published in 2003. And I wrote this in the UK. Nothing but a name and a sea flash of blue pulling me from my stranger's brooding. Barrack upon Tweed, a sudden blue reminding that these are British Isles and beautiful too. A fleeting look that feeds some need for sea, for mountain dew laughter, for dust, for sky, for woods and water, for Caribbean Barrack upon Tweed. To escape pursuing spirits, cross water, they say, for spirits cannot follow. But these have left the tang of mango, have crossed and mean to linger. From a train in England, on a journey home, a fleeting seascape, recalling dreams of home. And I begin with this because of this constant return to the Caribbean for me, wherever I am. And so I want to circle back and say something about those beginnings. I was born in Aruba. I claim all of the Caribbean. Grenada, most definitely, but all of the Caribbean. I was born in Aruba of parents who were migrant workers from Grenada. So here, you know, just from that moment of birth, we get something of that Caribbean story of migration, of Caribbean migrants going out in search of work, etc. Shortly after my birth, my parents returned to Grenada. And that is where I had that elementary education, which we cannot escape it, was very colonial, very British colonial. The poetry, and early on I realized I had this interest in language. And the early poetry that I was introduced to from elementary school was very much, you know, the lyrical ballads. So you're looking at poems by Wordsworth and Mrs. Hemans, and, you know, the narrative poetry of that period of the Romantics and the Victorians. And later on, at high school, I was given more of the same. So really, you know, there was that focus on the British in history and in literature. And it was at high school, though, I was introduced to the first Caribbean writer, who was the first novel we did for O-levels. And you hear the O-levels, A-levels scenario, you know that this is very much British colonial education. They thought Naipaul worthy enough to be introduced at that time in fifth form. So, you know, so I began to be introduced to a Caribbean voice. As far as history was concerned, and wait for it, as far as history was concerned, I enjoyed British history because my teachers loved it, right? And I thought, oh my gosh, the one subject I will fail for A-levels will have to be Caribbean history because I'm not getting into this at all. So as we think about that journey, you know, we were also thinking about colonialism. We cannot avoid it. And about our very colonial teachers, whether they were white or black, they were very much, the teachers I had were very much shaped by that colonial experience. And so they gave me a love for the word, but very often it was that British word. So if we're talking about unlearning, I had to unlearn a lot of that, keep the form and go back to many things later on, thinking, you know, it's not that I dislike the poetry. It is just that I wish I had been introduced to Caribbean poetry at the same time. But after all of that in Grenada, I went to my first university experience was at Mona, Jamaica. And at that period in the Caribbean, you had writers like Edward Kamau Brathwaite. You had the beginnings of a Caribbean literature conference, etc. So what the writers, and very much male writers at the time, what they were discussing, were, those things were very interesting for me. And it was at Mona too that I first got a taste of the African Writers series, because that's when they introduced African literature into the curriculum. So remember that Mona, that the University of the West Indies started off, and again, here we come back to the colonial context, they started off as the University College of the West Indies. They were a college of the University of London. And later on, they became the University of the West Indies. So, and of course, this had an impact. So in the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, which is when I was at Mona, there was a lot of that anxiety is not the word, but a lot of that agitation against colonial norms and colonial thinking, etc. That was, I entered Mona the year after Walter Rodney was expelled from Jamaica. So, you know, and all of that within the university system, tremendous agitation about Black power and what that means, what it meant in Canada and the United States, and what it meant in the Caribbean itself. So I was very much a product of that period of political agitation going throughout the Caribbean. By the time I returned to Grenada, taught in Grenada, taught high school in Grenada, taught high school also in St. Lucia. So you can hear why I'm claiming all of the Caribbean, right? And this was also a period when you were having Pan-Africanist groups emerging and, you know, discussion about who we really were, not as colonies of Britain, but as independent Caribbean people, whether or not we had that name, flag and anthem independence yet, but who we were as people without that British colonial string. So that was the period when I became very much involved in a lot of those discussions about change, about Pan-Africanism, about revolutionary change, etc. And there were other people from Grenada and the Caribbean. You mentioned Walter Rodney. There was Walter Rodney, Morris Bishop, etc. You know, people who, again, some had studied in the UK, some had studied in the US. And going back to the Caribbean, at that period, when there was a lot of discussion about Black political change, you had people in Grenada later on, for example, and you realize I'm leaving out a lot in the middle there, just kind of jumping ahead so that I won't be taking up all of the time. But in Grenada, in that period between about 1977, 1970, well, before that, between 1970 and 74, a lot of political agitation against the government that was regarded as very neo-colonial. And this is the period when revolutionary politics began to, you know, really develop in Grenada. And in an interesting way, Guyana, and, you know, that period of the PPP and Walter Rodney, etc. in Guyana, they were very much like teachers because they had gone through a lot of ideas about revolution and revolutionary change before. So the people in Grenada were learning a lot from that experience as well. I was involved, I became a part of the NWO, which was the National Women's Organization in Grenada during that period of the attempt at, and I'm only saying attempt at now after the fact, revolutionary change in Grenada between 1979 and 1983. Part of the women's movement, understanding that very often the very revolutionary men were not that revolutionary when it came to gender issues. So all of that kind of discussion, and a lot of which is going on around me, you know, here now, throughout the world, that all of those issues about gender and race were very much a part of this story, not only in Grenada, but throughout the Caribbean during that period. And, you know, as I say, I was very much involved in that kind of discussion. Later on, after the collapse of the Grenada process, the invasion by the United States, I went to the UK, and that is when, during that period in the UK, I found myself writing more and more about race. And I've skipped over lots of things there, because before that, I had gone to the US, done a master's, gone back to Grenada, etc. Now, in the UK in the 1980s, I became a part of a Pan-Africanist organization called African Dawn. And because of my interest in poetry, their interest in music, we were now speaking not only about the Caribbean, but about, you know, world Pan-Africanist movements. Members of that group were from Ghana, Zimbabwe, Uruguay. I was from Grenada, and we were performing poetry with music. At that period in the UK, I also met Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer who was putting his play on at the Africa Center. I don't know what the Africa Center is like now, but at the time, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Africa Center was a place where Caribbean and African people very often met, you know, and discussed the world movements, what's going on throughout the world. So that the trial of Dedan Kimathi, talking about the Mau Mau in Kenya, that was a play that I was a part of. So just to give you a sense of, it was Caribbean, yes, but we were also speaking about what was happening with world movements, what was happening with Black people throughout the world, and what it was possible, what kind of intervention we as young people then could make, you know, in these movements. So as we look around now, as I look around now and see the kind of activism that exists, of course, it very much reminds me of that period. And as I say, one of the fascinating things for me now is social media, and how young people are making use of that, so that I find that I am learning from that, very much learning from, you know, the practice and the experiences of the young people, still excited about the possibility of change. And for the couple minutes that remain to me, let me say, for example, that one of the things that happened in the UK was that I started to write a lot about race. For example, I remember on one occasion when there was an ad about a poetry competition, and basically the ad said, "No dialects, please. We're British." And I thought, oh no, I have to write a dialect poem. So, you know, thinking of the voices, thinking of the Caribbean voices, and I won't do all of the poem, but I know that I can say broadly that one of the things that had an impact on my approach to language was the perspective of Kamau Brathwaite, you know, all of the years of anti-colonial struggle, but also the perspective of Edward Kamau Brathwaite, a Barbadian writer who was in Jamaica at the time, and the way Kamau Brathwaite's concept of nation language focused on people, African people in the Caribbean, trying to construct a language of their own. So of course, when this No Dialects Please came up, I did a very performative poem for this competition, and I won't remember it all because I didn't think of reading it. I won't remember it all, but I do a little bit. For this competition, they were looking for poetry of worth, for a writing that could wrap up a feeling and fling it back hard with a captive power to choke the stars. So they say, send them to us, but no dialects, please. We're British. Well, I laughed till my bushet near drop. It's not only that I think about the dialect of the Normans and the Saxons that combine and reformulate to create a language elect. It's not only that I think of the story down there in the Caribbean when they say, no African languages, please. You're British. And it goes on. But you can hear you can hear where that poem is going. And so that's the kind of poetry I very often find myself writing in Britain because of the experiences of race. And there were also the poems that had to do with, I guess you would say, exile, looking back, etc. So knowing that I can't take too much of your time, I will end with a poem that is Because the Dawn Breaks. And you can hear how I very often structure my thinking within the poetry. And because the dawn breaks, we speak because when the rain falls in the mountains, the river slowly swells, comes rushing down over boulders, across roads, crumbling bridges that would hold their power against its force. We speak for the same reason that the thunder frightens the child, that the lightning startles the tree. We do not speak to defy your tenets, though we do, or to upset your plans, even though we do, or to tumble your towers of Babel. We speak in spite of the fact that we do. We speak because your plan is not our plan. We speak because we dream, because our dreams are not of living in pig pens in any other body's backyard, not of catching crumbs from tables, not of crawling forever along the everlasting ant line to veer away in quick detour when the elephant's foot crashes down, not of having to turn back when the smell of death assails our senses, not of striving forever to catch the image of your gods within our creation. We speak for the same reason that the flowers bloom, that the sun sets, that the fruit ripens, because temples built to honor myths must crumble as the dawn breaks. There is nothing you can do about your feeble bridges when the rain falls in the mountain and swells the flow of rivers. We speak not to agitate you, but in spite of your agitation, because we are workers, we are peasants, we are leaders, you see, and we were not born to be your vassals. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Merle. Yeah, it was so insightful to learn about your journey and the history of Grenada, but also those beautiful, beautiful poems. But yeah, our next speaker will be Rochelle, who will be talking about glorifying the Jamaican girl. Thank you, Merle.
Thank you for that introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here and to follow Merle and Lavinya. It's a real honor to share the stage with you, as it were. Hopefully, I'm going to share a talk that is sort of drawn from my book, Imagining Caribbean Womanhood. And I hope that it speaks to those themes of learning and unlearning, and we can sort of talk about that in just a moment in the questions. So I will keep an eye on the time there. Do nudge me if I'm running too much into the time we have for discussion. Okay, so yeah, this talk is called Glorifying the Jamaican Girl, Race, Nation and Beauty in 1950s and 60s Jamaica. And the story that I want to tell is the story of 10 Types, 1 People, which was a beauty competition in Jamaica. And this beauty competition, the 10 Types, 1 People beauty competition, began life in 1955. And I say began life because in a way, it kind of, as you'll see, it enters into legend after a while. But at the time, in 1955, it attracted over 3,000 participants and ran in the national tabloid, The Star, from May to December. And now I will just take you through the composition of the beauty competition because it is a little complicated. But there were actually 10 separate beauty competitions that made up 10 Types, 1 People. Each one of them represented a category for a specific skin tone. So 10 Types, it produced 10 winners, 1 from each competition, who would all reign simultaneously in 1955 as queens, as beauty queens. But crucially, as you might imagine, it was pretty crucial that no overall winner would preside. And these titles euphemistically described race and ethnicity and skin shade. So there was, for example, Miss Apple Blossom, Miss Allspice, and Miss Ebony. And I'll talk some more about those categories later on. And if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about the Miss Ebony category as well, which caused a massive stir at the time. But what was the purpose of the competition and what did it set out to do? Well, it was a form of national identity project, particularly shaped by patriotic men vying for power. So as we've heard, you know, this was the time, 1955, when this sort of ongoing process of decolonization was very much underway, and Jamaica was on the cusp of independence from the British Empire. And so at this time, Jamaica celebrated for the first time a national festival. But interestingly speaking, I wonder, was it Lavinya who touched on this in her talk? Interestingly, the festival began as a celebration of 300 years of Jamaica as a British colony. And that's why it was called Jamaica 300. But under the new People's National Party administration, it became much more of a conscious celebration of Jamaican nationalism and of Jamaica as a nation, rather than of Jamaica as a British colony, or at least that was the idea. And really the centerpiece of the Jamaica 300 Festival was the 10 Types, One People beauty competition. And Theodore Seeley, who was a patriotic Jamaican man committed to this Jamaican national ideal, he was the first Black editor of the Jamaican Gleaner, which was, you know, no small thing. And he was also the editor of its sister tabloid, The Star. And so he was very, very proud and excited of the competition. And he said, he described the competition as an audacious, forward-thinking solution to divisive racial politics. He said of the competition, rather grandiosely, Jamaica, which not only by her own boast, but by world acclaim, has long ago shown the right concept which enables peoples of diverse races to live and move together as one, has struck the final chord in a unique contest, 10 Types, One People. So clearly 10 Types was designed to transmit a national project to the Jamaican people, to really encourage Jamaican people to accept a specific model, of Jamaican nationalism. And so speaking of learning and unlearning, I really set out on this research project many years ago at the start of my doctoral work to show, I didn't know that I was going to uncover a history of Caribbean beauty competitions, but I was very interested in showing the history of Black beauty as a contested political thing, and of beauty competitions in the Caribbean. I'm just going to cite a few eminent people. So contemporary beauty competitions today in the Caribbean have been called far more serious than mere entertainment by Jamaican academic Carolyn Cooper. And Nicole Dennis Benn, whose novel I recently completed, her first novel. I'm now reading another of her second novel, but it's called Here Comes the Sun, and it deals with the massive significance of beauty queens in 90s Jamaica, being the massive kind of significance that they had, and you could argue continue to have in Jamaican society as like icons of beauty. So her book is set in 90s Jamaica, and she writes about that in such an insightful way. And Belinda Edmondson has called beauty competitions a regional obsession, a state-approved form of female spectacle, particularly useful in any discussion of the politics of femininity and of public performance in the Caribbean. And again, she's reflecting on today's beauty competitions. And I to be honest, I set out to write a project about sort of what we now refer to as kind of Windrush generation settlers in Britain. And I was fascinated by like my grandmother's generation and their emphasis on style and, you know, meticulous grooming. And that's where I began with my doctoral research. And it turns out that I sort of was carried by my research back into the Caribbean and discovered the wealth of archives that we have there, and really got stuck in to a whole host of Caribbean archives. But anyway, that's just to make the point that beauty competitions were not only significant in the Caribbean in the decades in the 20th century that I focused on in the book, but they have a history that is steeped in power and marginalization and protest and resistance. But they were also considered, you know, I mentioned before that there's a lot of patriotic men vying for power in this in this sort of beauty contest scene. They were really considered far too important to be left to the women. So I will name some interesting women who got involved in the beauty contest foray, but there seem to be so many more, you know, political patriotic men who were involved in them, and we can discuss why. So going back to the 10 Types One People competition and its claim to show the world how to end racism and live harmoniously, how did we arrive at this point, and what was the furore that the 10 Types competition seemed to answer? Well, as I describe in the book, since their inception in 1929, beauty competitions in Jamaica emerged as deeply political ventures which staged idealized performances of femininity that were pointedly racialized and class-bound. So pre-war Jamaica had seen the first Miss Jamaica contest, and it was really dominated by white identifying people, white Creoles, and it was nurtured by a really interesting figure, a publisher called Herbert DeLissa, who at that time in his life, at that time in his career, really strongly identified with the Creole upper class. And he sought to draw a veil over the social upheaval and the cultural awakening that was rocking Jamaica at that time in those interwar years. And instead, he used the beauty competition, the new Miss Jamaica competition, which was an idea really borrowed from the United States. He used that to espouse a very narrow nationalism that affirmed white Creole identities, really, almost in the teeth of, you know, what he was seeing. He kind of use that to affirm white Jamaicanness. And so Miss Jamaica at its birth was kind of quite, it was weird because it was public, as has been written about by other scholars. It was public but private, you know, so it was written about and these women would claim to be Miss Jamaica, but it was sort of a private party for elite families. And this provoked a feminist outcry from the amazing Una Marson, who many of you may know. She's of course a poet and a writer and a journalist in her career, and she actually came to Britain and started she was in Britain a number of times in her career, but at one point she worked for the BBC and brought a lot of Caribbean literary figures to the World Service, as it was then. Well, it wasn't called that then, but it's forerunner. And so she was responsible for bringing so many Caribbean voices to public broadcast via her program, which I think was called Caribbean Voices. Anyway, so back in the 30s, she spoke out against the early Miss Jamaica competition. And she said, some amount of expense and disappointment could be saved numbers of dusky ladies who year after year enter the beauty competition if the promoters of the contest would announce in the daily press that very dark or black beauties would not be considered. There's a growing feeling in many quarters that Miss Jamaica should be a type of girl who's more truly representative of the majority of Jamaicans. So she's really, really outspoken. And in spite of this outcry, over time, to be honest, the pattern continues. Really, it's just white identifying or very, very light-skinned coloured women, as they were known then, continue to dominate the competition until essentially the late 1950s. Around the same time, or not long after, the 10 Types One People competition emerges. Remember, that's 1955. So given this contentious background to beauty competitions in Jamaica, how did 10 Types do this sort of racial harmony work that it claimed to be doing? So while the Star, the tabloid, launched the 10 Types competition in May 1955 as an exceptional beauty competition, the first of its kind, with a very plural political message and a cleverly implied critique of the all-white Miss Jamaica contest. And the slogan was, every lassie has an equal chance, which is really significant in terms of what they're trying to do, because it's an open secret that the competition is very exclusive. And so this one poses itself as a real contrast to that. And the result of this competition was these 10 separate beauty queens, each one crowned alongside her fellow queens as a national representative. And I'm going to take you through the names just now. And perhaps I'll do that while sharing my screen, actually. That always takes a couple of seconds. I don't need to share audio, but I'm just going to show you an image of the competition, of the candidates. Can you see that? Or, yeah, thank you, Drew. I'm just going to blow it up. I've got a funny view here. Hope you can see the full image. Okay, so you have Miss Ebony, who was a Jamaican girl of black complexion, and later, actually, interestingly, the sort of moniker that is given her that category is coal black or cool black, with two terms that we used, which I think is really revealing. We could talk about that later. And then there's Miss Ebony. In fact, let me just bear with me. I need to stop sharing just for a moment, read you a little more, and then share. So there's the Jamaican girl of black complexion. That's Miss Ebony. Miss Mahogany is a Jamaican girl of cocoa brown complexion. Miss Satinwood is a Jamaican girl of coffee and milk complexion. And the names are so important, as I'm sure you're grasping as I go through them. Miss Golden Apple is a Jamaican girl of peaches and cream complexion. Miss Apple Blossom, a Jamaican girl of European parentage. And we're just halfway through. Then you have Miss Pomegranate, who's a Jamaican girl of white Mediterranean parentage. Miss Sandalwood, a Jamaican girl of pure Indian parentage. Miss Lotus, a Jamaican girl of pure Chinese parentage. Miss Jasmine, a Jamaican girl of part Chinese parentage, and Miss Allspice, a Jamaican girl of part Indian parentage. And let me show you that image again. So these are the winners from 1955. And forgive me, that should say 1955, it says 1959. But I'll show you the winner. Well, I won't be able to show you the winner, but I will talk about 1959 in just a moment. So these are all of the winners. And yeah, it's fascinating. And what I argue in the book, that this image is really interesting, because the way the women are posed and everything is to try and convey an idea of a universal standard of beauty that Jamaican women absolutely can perform against. And there's sort of a universalizing way in which this image is constructed. They're all posed in exactly the same way and looking at the camera in the same way. And it kind of emphasizes, if anything, the similarities between them rather than the sort of the differences. They're all very, very slim and petite, and in many ways it's a very conventional beauty competition, with the only difference being that you know, they make this claim to be representing racial harmony through it. So it's that picture, I think, you know, there's a lot of things. Oh dear, let me stop sharing. There's so many things going on in that image. We can talk about it later. But what I argue is that there's an attempt to imagine these color categories as to give some measured proportionality to the division of Jamaican society into tenths, almost, as it were, as though to give each category a sort of to have them represent a tenth of the diverse whole of the population. And in the process, they actually confine what would have then been the most numerous kind of demographic category, people with deep brown skin tones, to only one or two of those categories. You know, Miss Ebony and Miss Mahogany actually represent what the vast majority of Jamaican people would have looked like at this time, even before the sort of massive white flight in the 70s and 80s of the tiny white ruling class. So moreover, the visual array gave primacy to categories that reference sort of racial mixes, those that reflected the ethnic composition of the diverse sort of coloured middle class, as they were known. So in this parade of feminine beauty, brownness was imagined very much expansively and occupied a number of those given categories that I sort of walked you through, those endless categories. And the array of light brown beauty queens really suggested the preeminence in the Jamaican social landscape of light-skinned brownness as a social category in the ascendancy and worthy of broad national representation. So the 10 Types panorama of feminine beauty, which had attempted to deliver this multiracial model of modern Jamaica, was also kind of weakened by what it showed as the persistent unease and difficulty with which it tried to imagine the place of Blackness in this new political order that would represent modernity and a future beyond the British Empire. But it also kind of, as I argue in the book, it does the work of kind of legitimizing this, the primacy of brownness. And I'll just say a few more words to sum up about the kind of the life that the 10 Types beauty competition has beyond 1955. So they decide to stage the competition again, such was its impact, starting in 1959, and they begin with Miss Ebony in 1959, and the novelty of Miss Ebony really attracts massive attention in very interesting and peculiar ways. So it draws a lot of attention from abroad. American audiences and American visitors to the island are particularly impressed and very glad that the Miss Ebony contestants seem happy with their sort of content with their lot. That seems really, really important, that they are sort of humble enough to enter this competition where it's essentially said you'll be pitted against women who are, the implication is that, they're being pitted against, more powerful, more recognized beauties than their own.
I'm so sorry, Rochelle. I'm going to have to cut you off there. But that's just because we need to introduce the Q&A. And
okay.
We'll be able to go into all of the topics and have an amazing discussion where you can talk about everything that you wanted to talk about. Sorry about that. But thank you so much, first of all, to all three of our panelists. The discussion that we've already heard has been so insightful. And we've already got some people who are interested in asking questions. So you can raise your hand and then unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. And you're free to leave your camera off if you want to, and direct it to any of the panelists. But if there aren't any questions, then we can start with some pre-submitted ones to kick off the discussion. So I'll just give anybody who's a brave person and wants to go first, a few more seconds to raise a hand and ask a question. If not, that's fine, because I have, we've got Morgan. Yes, okay, please unmute yourself and go away. Start off.
Sure, thanks. Well, good day to everybody, but also thank you guys so much for organizing this. And thanks to the three panelists. I feel like somebody mentioned in the chat that they feel like their brain is already swelling. And having been a grad student at Oxford already for 2 terms, I feel like this is one of the more informative experiences of my time so far. But I actually have 2 questions. The first one is for Lavinya. And I'm just curious, like from a Jamaican perspective, like even in Jamaica, we don't really learn so much about like Black Jamaican history. Like folks might learn about the Maroons in terms of Nanny not signing, the sort of infamous treaty with the British and that sort of thing. But otherwise, there's no real mention of like how slavery and the legacy of slavery impacts us today. We don't learn about Claude McKay. We don't learn about the labor movement of the 30s or Rastafarianism or any of those things that are so central to life in Jamaica. So my first question to Lavinya is how do you, I guess, decide which aspects of Black British history and Black Caribbean history you include in the curriculum? Is it sort of like an ever expanding project, or are there certain events or scholars that you tend to highlight? And my second question is for Dr. Rowe, just concerning your studies of sort of Caribbean beauty. I think about like Jamaica today, nobody really articulates these distinctions between being sort of a wheatish complexion or of a sort of high brown or a darker brown or a more swarthy or less swarthy, either you're brown or you're black, or you're of a different race. So I'm wondering if you came across any literature that sort of spoke to this sort of distillation of all these different 10 types into like the sort of more binary that we see in modern times between just light skin and dark skin. Thank you.
So thank you. With the Black curriculum, at the moment we are focusing particularly on recent Black history, Black British history, because, and here is, I guess, so my brain is doing a lot. Rochelle, you really just popped this side of my brain open. So basically with Black history, what we're trying to do in the UK is make sure that British history is taught more openly, that includes aspects of Black history. So we take a more thematic approach to look at periods and events within British history that are significant, detailing the experiences and events of Black people in Britain. So really that ranges from contemporary Black history, as we like it, from right now, through figures such as, I don't know, like take for example Stormzy, and we go all the way back to someone like the Ivory Bangle lady, who was one of the first Romans to live in the UK, who was a Black woman. So it really just ranges thematically, but also because schools at the moment are learning from what's on their specifications, we also have to kind of align what we want schools and teachers to teach with what's there. So it kind of depends on what's there. So at the moment, it's an amalgamation of everything. But I hope that going forward, we can kind of like continue to evolve the content as more research comes out, because at the moment there's probably like 3 main books: Akala's Natives, David Olusegun's Black and British, and Miranda Kaufman's Black Tudors. So there's not much kind of literature at the moment that's out there on Black history. So as more research is done, we hope to kind of expand that as well as orality. So yeah.
Thanks, Morgan. That's a great question. Apologies, I didn't notice I had a few time warnings in the chat on time. I wasn't aware. But your question, Morgan, is really helpful because essentially it's interesting to note that what you say about the fact that Jamaican identities have kind of been distilled now into the brown and Black. And I think what I would have summed up by saying is that is essentially where we end up after the 10 types competition itself formally ends. But it really influences the development and the preeminence of Miss Jamaica and its kind of brown type that gets embedded in the sort of 60s and 70s and thereafter. And so I think it really kind of, in some ways, it does the work of kind of legitimizing sort of brownness and brown femininity as the key Jamaican identity, and in terms of, which then is contested, you know, over generations. But yeah, it makes sense that we end up today with something that sort of says, you know, brown and Black are the 2 sort of ways to identify, because a lot of these identity projects, these beauty competitions, are kind of doing that work. And even though at first glance 10 types looks like it's really trying to be very, very inclusive, but in quite a specific, quite a sort of very rigid way, it actually is imagining brownness very, very broadly. So you raise a really interesting point. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you. If anybody else has questions, feel free to use the raise hand function and unmute yourselves.
If not, in the meantime, I just wanted to touch on something that Rochelle, you've just mentioned, and something I thought of during Mel's speech as well, in that you see a lot of activism happened in the past, and you see that people were asking for very similar things to what we're still asking for today. And we still have issues of colorism, we still have issues of Black beauty standards, especially when it comes to the feminist approach and how women are perceived. And so you wonder sometimes, is there actual change being made, or are we kind of just being like spun in this circle where things are just happening again and again? And like, what are the younger generation doing that can help and is helping to actually break out of this cycle? Yeah, anyone who wants to talk on that, please do.
Yeah, I'll go first if I may. Thanks, Drew. It's a really interesting point, and I think that ties to what I was saying at the start about, you know, your theme of learning and unlearning. I was really heartened and fascinated, really, to see, like, down the years in the Caribbean, there'd been all of these Black and brown people who were speaking out against, you know, ideas of colorism, and also of, you know, the ways in which white supremacy infiltrated all aspects of Caribbean society. And so I suppose, yeah, it's the learning and unlearning of the sort of the things that we assume are new conversations, when actually they have incredibly, you know, deep roots, and we can look to what our forebears were doing on these things. Like, it can be really instructive, because I am really heartened by the revival of the conversation about colorism, and it's a word that more people understand now, and we have a language for it, and you can almost like buy a mainstream sort of magazine and see interesting content on it nowadays, which is like, oh, okay. which is fun and good, and I'm glad that we're talking about it and that Black women are writing about it in the national press. But yeah, if we look to the history of beauty in Black Britain and in the Caribbean, we'll see lots of people decrying, like Una Marson, who herself is, I think it's fair to say, she's from a very well-to-do brown middle-class Jamaican family. She's also the darkest of her siblings, and so relatively speaking, she is kind of in her family suffering. Her biographer puts it really well in terms of the kinds of femininity that was fated in her family and how she kind of fell short of those ideas. So yeah, there's lots of voices, Caribbean voices, early feminist voices, decrying the oppressive ideas of beauty that Jamaican women are being, you know, asked to extol. So yeah, great question. I'll defer to Merle now.
Okay, I think, in fact, that Rochelle said it, you answered it, that yes, definitely there is actual change being made. Sometimes you can think, oh, it's not going quickly enough. You know, if this discussion has been there for so long, why are we still here? But in a sense, I think, as Rochelle just said, she's seeing more about the discussion of colorism. And that in itself is a big change. And I think that is only kind of one representation of things. So I would say yes. Even though it might seem to be going slowly, I don't think it's going that slowly. I think there is a lot of change. And, as I listen to young people today, I say, absolutely, this is the kind of talk we need. It's good that it is still there and increasing. As you were talking, for example, of Nanny of the Maroons, I thought, all right, 30 years ago, we didn't, for example, have a book like Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber, which has a Nanny Webb, so you have Nanny of the Maroons in a fantasy land, constructing a kind of, virtual web. So things like that, the way people are taking on these issues and in one discipline or another. For example, in Nalo Hopkinson's case, this is a literature text, it's fantasy, but it makes you sit down and investigate the history behind the things she's talking about. And that is just one example, but I think throughout we have several ways in which we can say, yeah, absolutely, things are changing, and it's important that the discussions continue.
Thank you both. I think sometimes we're tempted to take a more pessimistic approach, but it's good to hear people who actually know about the history speaking on it. And Yasmin, you have a question? Go ahead.
Hi, and this is slightly more directed to Dr. Collins, but I study English as well, and I was wondering if like you ever felt obligated to include your identity in your writing, like looking at especially like young adult novels and stuff. There's not a lot of Black characters or Black narratives that exist outside of that identity politics, like talking about like fantasy stories and that kind of thing. So as like a prominent writer, did you ever feel like you had to include something about it? You were never just free to write what you wanted?
A great question. And I am pleased that I'm answering this question after having mentioned Nalo. Because Nalo Hopkinson's work is fantasy, and we have other Caribbean fantasy writers. At the time that I was writing, that's what I wanted to write. So I think, you know, a lot depends on at what point you get into it, you know, at what point you are constructing your imaginative explorations of the region, and what makes you decide to take on one form or the other. I remember on one occasion, for example, one of my students who is now teaching in Jamaica, in fact, asked me, can you tell me about novels about the middle-class Caribbean identity? Do they exist? Because she thought she was reading so much of a particular kind of class experience that she wanted something else. Yes, in this case, she was still speaking about realism, but yes, they do exist. And, you know, so I was able to guide her in that direction. And your question is wonderful. You were asking, all right, what about fantasy and other forms, you know? Who are the people writing? And now you can think of Tobias, you think of Nalo Hopkinson, you think of Jacob Ross. So there are people writing fantasy. I think there was a particular point of the Caribbean story when writers were really focusing on realism. So we're talking about the 1930s, the 1950s, the 60s, 70s, when a lot of the focus was on realism. Increasingly, you continue to have realism, but you also have an interest in other forms. That's a great question. And I'm looking forward to your novel in the future where you are looking at, you know, because you definitely don't have to stay with realism. Exploring outside of that is important. And let me just say, for example, I know in one novel, The Color of Forgetting, where I decided to kind of go a little bit towards this idea of inventing a character called Carib, who had kind of come from the past and she existed in the future. And, you know, so it was still history, but I was trying something with a different kind of form. And I think that will increasingly be happening, especially perhaps for younger generations of writers. It's great to see some of them doing it, and I know it will continue.
Thank you.
I love that question, particularly as well, because I remember reading something by Merle Collins where you were talking about the stories of Anansi and like that being one very popular, not childhood stories, but well, kind of, yeah, childhood stories that you're introduced to. And that's fantasy and stuff that's so far from realism, but also you feel like it could be realism. Like for those of you who don't know, I never really understood if it was a story about a man who turned into a spider or a spider who sometimes was a man, but it's basically that kind of story that tells proverbs. It's really interesting, it's amazing. If you haven't heard it, I would definitely recommend reading. But yeah, you definitely find the fantasy there and it's very gripping. But yeah, any other questions to ask our panelists? Oh, go ahead. Is that Yasmin's hand up again? Or mistake? I think it might be a mistake.
I think I'll pose a question while we wait and see if anyone else has any questions. But my question's for Lavinya, and I don't know if you're aware, but there's like constantly calls. Well, yeah, I guess everyone is. But it's constantly calls to decolonize Oxford and like the spaces, and like these elite institutions, and having founded like the Black curriculum and your experience with that, what advice would you have for students that are wishing to help change these spaces and the narratives within these spaces, like Oxford?
So I'd say the most important thing, and this is something that I think SOAS made me really realize, is that these conversations aren't just limited to societies. In the spaces where you can think imaginatively and also connect with other students. So for example, in essays, in more public forums, it's really important to host those conversations, because it's all about that cultural shift. And if these conversations are all always relegated to spaces that's only between us, we won't really see that kind of appetite. I do acknowledge that there are limitations though, and especially when it comes to the reproduction of knowledge, if you don't have lecturers that are invested in this kind of knowledge and decolonizing, it's very difficult for that to be sustained. So I think more broadly, there needs to be more of a shift, not only for Black lecturers, but more lecturers that are Black, but also understand the importance of knowledge and want to kind of shift the narratives that do exist. I don't know if you guys have returned that CROC call yet, but that also needs to happen. There's institutions still carry a lot of weight, such as Oxford and Cambridge, when there's like cultural artifacts that, you know, don't belong there. And I think that's also something that has to happen at the same time. It can't be this is a call, but this is also a conversation we're having. It's more broad. So I think just being aware of how to pull those things together, which is very difficult, but it's really well done when it's done. Yeah.
Rhiannon, go ahead.
Thank you. Rui, if you want to go.
Hi, this is directed at anyone. I feel like often these conversations start in like literature or history, which obviously is like where like all three of you have been focused on. How do you think that by changing narratives and like changing history, how do you think that can affect people in day-to-day lives who like aren't necessarily interested in academia, or like who don't go to university, or like aren't looking to kind of find their identity through these narratives in history and literature? How does that affect them and like benefit them? Like, how do we bring it to like non-academically interested people?
Well, I can begin. I don't know that I have the answers, but that again is an ongoing conversation. And because I think that because as academics, we also have to make choices, the kind of approaches that we have, I think those are important, but it's not only that. There are lots of community activists. There are lots of people working out there who are not working in academia and are doing important work as community activists. So I think if as academics, we have an interest in that and we think we can contribute something, that kind of coordination, that kind of cooperation is important. And you know, you say that here we are all perhaps literature, history, that kind of focus. I think that very often academic institutions, wherever we are, give service, a lot of lip service to interdisciplinarity, but sometimes it doesn't actually happen. You know what I'm saying? So I'm thinking, for example, in fact, it's a discussion I was having just today, so I can, you know, put something from in there. There was a student who was telling me he's from Latin America. He's from Guatemala. And he was telling me, you know, that within engineering, he's a civil engineer, and he wants to go back to rural Guatemala and do activist kind of work on the environment, but he's not learning something specifically about Guatemala and what he's doing now, or about Latin America. the kind of broad civil engineering issues, he says, doesn't, really look at that. But if he isn't a part of a Latin American environment, then he can talk about what he knows it's possible to do within there and develop a methodology for himself, how to work within these communities, because that is what he wants to do. And I'm saying whether or not you find it in your department or within your discipline, you have lived that and you know how it might be possible to interact in there. And of course, you're having discussions not only with academics, but you're having discussions with people in the community who also know these systems and can understand, how you might make a difference. So I would say, although even when you don't see it happening, you have a vision, and it is about, finding ways to change things with that vision. For example, in this case, he was telling me about rural Guatemala and environmental issues and all of that. And then the more I asked him about what he was learning, I was being taught, what it might be possible for him to do. You see what I'm saying? So these kinds of conversations across disciplines also help, so that as young people in various disciplines, it seems to me that interdisciplinarity too is something you can push for within academia, but also recognizing that it's not only academia that is important to make these changes, that there are activist organizations, there are organizations out there who are doing very serious, very important work within organizations, within groups, within countries, and sometimes the cooperation with them is important for, for us as academics who have that interest. So that's my 2 cents.
I'm not sure if anybody else wanted to comment on that. If not, that's okay.
Thank you so much.
I was going to say, I think Merle she hit it on the head, like absolutely, it is that approach. I think the only thing that I would add is also looking to artists. There are so many musicians and actors who are paving the way for themselves because they have access, and I think access is also very important. If you don't have access to knowledge, then you just don't know. So I think, yeah, there's also inspiration to be drawn from people who are just doing great work. Yeah.
Thank you, Lavinya, and thank you, Mel. As an engineering student myself, it was like inspiring to hear about that conversation. But yeah, we ran a few minutes over, so I think we'll wrap it up there. But thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Lavinya, Mel, Rochelle, and to everybody who joined us today. Thank you for all your questions, and yeah, have a good evening.
Thank you.
You.
Great.
Thank you.
Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Lovely to meet you.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Good to meet you all.
Goodbye.
Thank you.